All right, I want to thank everybody for coming to our Intro to Energy Law event today. This is part of our Lunch and Learn series where we have been doing a number of educational topics. Of course, last year during the pandemic, we did a different topic every day for a couple of months. And we found this format to be really great for sharing messaging. And we are going to record this and make it available to people afterward. And I'm really pleased to introduce our speakers, who are Cary Shepard and Nancy Loeb, both from Northwestern, but I'm going to let them more thoroughly introduce themselves as we get started. I am also going to put into the chat a link. If you're an attorney, you will need to fill out the Google Doc that I'm putting in with the CLE link. So please fill that out with the time that you've arrived and all of this. So Cary or Nancy, I don't know if you want to put up slides, but take it away.
Great. Let me just get this presentation set up here. All right, current slide. And I think here we go. All right, can everybody see just the one slide there? I think that's right. All right, awesome. Nancy, would you like to start off?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I am Nancy Loeb. I am the director of the Environmental Advocacy Center / Clinic at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. And I've had the great privilege of working with Cary for the last couple of years and want to just acknowledge that. Cary, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, hi everybody. For those of you that I haven't met before, my name is Cary. I'm a legal fellow at the Environmental Advocacy Center, where I work with Nancy, and I've been working with Nancy for the last couple of years, as well as with Jen and the great team at IEC on a number of things during the same period. So looking forward to getting started. And as I'm sure you all know from signing up, today's presentation, or today's CLE, is going to be talking about the Intro to Energy Law. And just as a quick start or note before we get started, the reason we decided to call it Intro to Energy Law is because this is very much an introduction. Energy law is an extremely broad subject with specializations in everything from federal regulation to local utility control. And today, I think our goal is just kind of try to give you a broad overview of it, and then just touch on a couple of kind of key themes and important considerations, especially from an environmental perspective. So great. With that, I'm going to move on to the next slide here. So I think, you know, as funny as it is, one of the first questions that's important to ask yourself when you're getting into the topic of energy law is, what is energy, right? And I think, you know, I know starting with the dictionary definition can be a bit of a cliche, but I think that's important here, right? And the first definition here, right, the strength and vitality required for sustained physical activity or physical or mental activity is in many ways, I think, what we think about from a personal perspective. But realistically, it's the second definition that I think is most applicable to the work that we're going to be talking about today, which is power derived from the utilization of physical or chemical resources, right? How do we make things move or turn lights on, right? What does that impact? How does that impact our environment? How do we regulate that? And just kind of getting into that question and looking at what makes all the things in the world move and work. That's what energy law is, and that's also why it is such a broad topic. So, Nancy.
Yes, and I apologize. The coughing is allergies. I just want to point that out, and I'm sorry. So what I'm going to talk about just for a couple of minutes here is how we actually use energy in the US. And there are 4 principal sectors in which we use energy. One is the industrial sector. And within the industrial sector, this is literally what it sounds like. This is industry, which is using energy to produce things, most generally. Commercial is more things like the electricity in the stores that we go into, or shopping centers, something like that. Residential is our homes and apartments. And transportation is all forms of transportation. So cars, trucks, buses, airplanes, a very important source or use within this sector. And as you can see, industrial is our largest source. This is 2019 numbers. Industrial is the largest source. Transportation, not source, consumption sector. Transportation is also a very significant sector, as well as commercial and residential. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Cary, I think.
Probably should just keep myself off mute there. Yes, thanks, Nancy. And so, that's where we actually use the energy, right? To move things around, to build things, to turn lights on in office buildings. But when dealing with energy law, you need to it's important to know that these are just because you use energy somewhere does not mean that is where it is produced. So what the chart here is total energy consumption by end use sector, and then it's broken out by primary energy, meaning energy that is actually produced in this industry or in this sector, purchased electricity, which means, of course, if you're buying electricity from the grid, that's another source of power. And then, of course, there's just loss, right? Some energy we produce and we're not actually able to use it for a valuable purpose. Nothing is perfectly efficient. And so just to kind of break this out to understand why we have this graph up, the first sector, transportation, is entirely primary energy, or at least it was in 2018. And the reason is primarily because what that means is we are producing energy by burning fossil fuels like gasoline and diesel to move airplanes, to move cars, et cetera, right? Cars and freight trains are not, getting their energy from elsewhere. They are using it, at the source and producing it at the source. Now, if you compare that to industrial, right, we start to see more of a mix. A lot of industrial processes, they use energy that is produced on site through, via small power plants or by, burning materials to heat up different substances. But they also purchase electricity from other sources. And then kind of as you see through the residential and commercial, we see even more of that, right? With residential, we buy a lot of power. Primary energy is primarily things like burning of natural gas in stoves or natural gas for heating. And then commercial is kind of the same. And a lot of where energy law intersects is how it is that we regulate the production and getting access to these different energy sources. And of course, that is very different based on sector here. And so the regulation can be different, both based on the sector as well as based on the source of energy.
And Cary, before you change this slide, I'll just add one point of note here. And that's just to highlight for people how much energy is actually lost in changing its form for use. So in transportation, the car is immediately burning the gas, and or in other types of transportation. So we don't have to transport it in some way or along some kind of wire where there's a significant amount of loss. And this becomes really important because, especially in a world of climate change, where we want to preserve or use as little energy as we can, becoming more efficient in how we use energy becomes extremely important. This is sort of what economists might call, in another context, dead weight loss. It contributes nothing to productivity in the sector at all. And so the more efficient we can be in our use of energy, the less loss there is, the better it is in terms of preserving the resources as well as not contributing to climate change. Thanks, Cary.
Great, thanks, Nancy. And so within this, there are a number of different sources of energy, right? When you think about like the power to move things, the power to turn lights on. But the focus of our talk today is going to be about electricity in the grid. So that's really only a subsection. We're not going to be talking about pipelines for gasoline or diesel. We're not going to be talking about jet fuel. Primarily what we're going to be discussing today is electricity in the grid, which is a very big part of the energy sector, but it is not the only source of energy that we have. All right. And so Nancy, I think you start off here.
Yeah, and I'm going to look at this and talk about it a little in the historic context. I think this chart tells us so much about where we've been and why, and where we are now, and possibly where we're going. So I'm going to suggest and ask everybody to take a look going back to about 1970. And what you can see there, for one thing, is our use of electricity, energy for electricity. Our total electricity consumption was far, far lower than it is now. And so we have grown massively in our use of electricity and most of the sources that we use for it. So back in the 1970s, when I'm sure some people on this call were not around, first in 1973, and then again in 1979, related to OPEC boycotts, we had absolute energy crunches where gas and oil became unavailable. Well, let me actually go back. If you go back to about 1970, up until 1950, 70, we were self-sufficient as a country in energy. And excuse me, we later became more and more dependent on outside sources of especially oil and gas. And so in the 1970s, beginning in 1973, with the first oil boycott of the US related to issues in the Middle East, we were actually could feel the effects of our need to bring in energy from other sources. And so what you see starting to happen there is a realization that we want to stop our dependence on international oil, which we didn't do in the greatest way and still haven't entirely. But what you start seeing there is our electricity sector from there going forward reduces its use of oil. And so the electricity sector becomes far less dependent on oil as a source of energy. What you also start seeing at about the same time is a great expansion of coal as a primary resource and the primary resource for oil. And part of why that's happening is because we have lots of coal in the United States. We have an abundance of coal, and it's relatively less expensive than other, or has historically until about now, been relatively less expensive than other sources of energy for use in electricity. So you start to see this very strong buildup of coal, which becomes the primary source of primary energy source for electricity in the US. Another thing that you see is that natural gas also increases. It was sort of at a steady state for a long time and was used for electricity mostly in the Northeast until you get to about the 2000s and into the aughts, and you start to see this very big spike in use of natural gas. Well, what's the cause of that? The cause of that is fracking. Natural gas goes from becoming a limited and very expensive resource to a very available and very cheap resource. And so natural gas becomes much more competitive against coal. It becomes much more available. Coal becomes as we'll talk about, becomes recognized as a very dirty, from an environmental and climate perspective, dirty source of energy. And so we reduce coal as a source of energy, and it is largely replaced by natural gas. I'll talk quickly about nuclear. As you can see, when you get to about the year 2000, it's pretty much steady in terms of the amount of it that we use. Why is that? Because we have not really built new plants, new nuclear plants in the United States since around the late 1980s, early 1990s, when some came online. And we'll talk more about nuclear in a little bit, but that one stayed sort of constant. The other thing you see growing in here is renewables. And we'll get much more into what the sources of renewables are. You can see there's sort of a certain amount of renewables that's fairly constant until about 2000, and then it starts to build more and then really builds more after 2008. What you're seeing before that dip and before around 2000 is primarily hydro, and we'll talk about hydro. What you start to see as you get past that is the introduction of more wind and solar. Cary, did you want to add anything on this?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I like to point out when going over this is really with respect to why this subject matter is so important. So if you were to take this chart here of electricity generation across the United States and compare it to a chart that shows the United States' growth of gross domestic product during the same period of time, you would see a very similar chart. And really what that tells us is that electricity generation is very closely tied to our gross domestic product and therefore what our economy runs on. Now, of course, there's some recent changes to that, but just as a couple of examples as to why, like for example, you can even see the 2008-2009 recession right here, just chunked out of that chart. That decrease really is related to reduction in economic activity in the United States. And you can see other examples of that, over the course of this chart, as Nancy was describing earlier. So, what may seem like a fairly mundane chart at first glance really tells a lot about the history of our country, from international politics to economic activity. So, I mean, I think this is it's really a critical subject, and I find it really interesting. The only other thing I'll say about that.
I'm sorry, Cary. I was just going to add one more thing. We do see this steady growth, and we're not seeing a big shrinkage now. In fact, our electricity usage is going up again. Interesting to think about where that's coming from. How are we doing this CLE? We're all on our computers. And I can think of 3 or 4 things that I plug in every night. So even as we become more efficient, as we leave rooms and remember to turn out the lights, we are constantly introducing more uses, more methods of consumption than existed historically. Okay.
Great, thank you, Nancy. And so, and the last thing I'll just say about this chart is that the economic growth comparison to this chart, you do see that after about 2010, our economy certainly has grown, but the amount of electricity generation has not grown so much. And that's largely because of something that's invisible on this chart, but very important, which is the improvement of energy efficiency for industrial processes, for home energy uses, and other purposes such as that. So with that, we're going to talk a bit about some of these specific energy sources, how they impact the environment, and why it is that energy regulation is one of the most direct ways to actually work on some of these important environmental problems. So first one that I'm going to list here is coal-fired power plant electricity production. And really, the crux of the way this works is fairly straightforward. You take a fuel, which is coal, after you mine it, you burn it, and you use the steam and the heated water to turn a turbine, which is then converted into electricity, which is the function of what turbines do. Now, in the process of doing that, there are a lot of really important things to keep in mind. One of which is the environmental impacts. We have very significant air emissions from coal-fired power. Coal is the most polluting energy source that we have available today. We also have very significant water discharges, the types of pollutants that can be particularly dangerous for communities of people are exposed to them, ranging from mercury to all the sorts of different things that are in coal ash. And then speaking of coal ash, of course, we also have the production of coal ash, which is a material that is toxic. It can be carcinogenic, and it sticks around for a very long time and causes very serious health problems if it gets into anybody's water supply. So this power source, which has been around forever, has provided reliable power to the United States. But the negative externalities associated with it are just massive. And this is one of the reasons why, hopefully, we're seeing a shift away from these energy sources. And then just to give an example, this photograph here is the Prairie State Energy Campus, which is the largest coal-fired power plant in the state of Illinois, one of the largest pollution sources, period, in the United States. And power plants like this, so this is what would be considered a fairly modern coal plant, despite having newer technologies than a lot of the coal plants that existed or were built 50, 60, 70 years ago, it still has all these problems. It still puts out massive amounts of emission into the air. It still generates massive amounts of coal ash. And so this is an energy source that, despite its historic benefits for electricity production, is, creating a serious impact on the planet and is not in any way without externalities. So with that, let's take a look at gas with Nancy.
Okay, so gas looks a lot like coal when you diagram it, the use of it. You take the primary fuel and it is burned, and that burning creates a steam, which turns a turbine, which leads to which feeds in turns a generator, which creates the electricity. This is a combined cycle gas power plant that we're looking at here. So this is a little bit more efficient because it reuses some of the steam and spins it around so that you're turning generator twice. Still not a highly efficient means of creating electricity. I think that the most efficient combined cycle plants right now are still not much above 70%. I'm not certain about that, but I think that's the case. In terms of the environmental consequences, the big environmental consequences of natural gas come in not as much at the point of burning, but more at the point of extraction. Gas generally comes out of the same wells that oil comes out of. And historically, oil has been a much more valuable financial product than gas. So where oil is what is being extracted, gas is just seen as more of an annoyance, and it is often flared or burned directly into the environment. The problem with this is that natural gas contains methane, and methane is one of the most most effective means of warming the climate. It is much more powerful in terms of its warming qualities than carbon is. So it's especially a concern, and this is why a lot of people talk about natural gas as a transition to cleaner fuels. And some people, including me, think that's very dangerous because it is not, once we make the investments for this, people are going to be less inclined, just as they have been with coal, to walk away from the investments. But there are very significant environmental harms from using the natural gas. Cary? And this is a picture of a natural gas plant. It looks a lot like the coal plant that Cary showed you. That's because a lot of the modern natural gas plants have actually been retrofits into coal plants.
Great, thank you, Nancy. And so the next source that I want to talk about is hydropower, right? So in the chart that we looked at earlier, we saw that renewable energy has been a constant source of energy in the United States for quite a few decades now. Most of that historically has come from hydropower. And again, at its core, the way this works is not a very different technology from coal or gas in that we are spinning a turbine to create electricity. The difference, of course, in this circumstance is that we're using water pressure to do that as opposed to burning a fuel. Now, a lot of people may think at first glance that as a result of using, kind of a river's natural flow to power something, that this would be without environmental consequences. But that's not the case. There's a number of things that hydropower plants or dams do in the process of operating. One of which is flooding, of course, flooding out ecosystems, causing damage to areas. But in the process of doing that, actually, flooding is a very large source of methane emissions. So we don't have a smokestack coming from hydropower plants in the same way that you do from coal or gas plants. But it's important to realize that while hydropower is technically renewable, it's not without environmental consequences. Something else to be aware of, and actually I'll just pull up this photo as we're taking a look at this. Something else to be aware of is, it can look nice enough. I mean, I certainly think this is more aesthetically appealing than a coal plant, right? This does disrupt ecosystems. And in the United States, at least, one of the reasons why it is that we have not expanded the amount of hydropower over the last 50 years or so is because of the fact that we're tapped out. We've basically put a dam everywhere in the United States that we can, and there's not really any other good sources. Anywhere that we'd be adding a dam would probably be reducing the efficiency of other dams. And so I'm not a hydrological engineer, but basically the story is that we can't expand hydropower use in the United States because we've put it everywhere that we can. But it is something that's being considered expanding in other developing nations. And I think it's important to be aware of the environmental problems associated with that, including the climate impacts. All right, so up next, we have nuclear power with Nancy. Nancy, am I taking this one or you? I'm sorry. You're still muted there.
Either way, I'm fine with you taking it, Cary, or I can take
Why don't you go ahead and I'll add any comments if, yeah.
So this is a schematic of a type of nuclear reactor, a boiling water reactor. But what you can see is even though nuclear is extremely high tech compared to burning coal, the principles of how it works are exactly the same. You take a fuel, in this case, typically uranium, which is placed inside of rods, and you can see those rods inside the container. Cary, maybe you can do an arrow to show people where that is. The nuclear reaction creates an incredible amount of heat, which again creates steam, which turns a turbine, which turns a generator, and the electricity that's generated goes onto transmission lines. So the very basic principles of how power is generated operate the same way. It's really the fuel that's burning that's different. I mentioned that we have not expanded nuclear power in the US for about 30 plus years now. One of the reasons is the extreme risks. If something does go wrong, then it goes very wrong, as we saw in Fukushima. And so politically, especially after Fukushima, there is a bias against building nuclear power plants. Nuclear power plants are also incredibly expensive to build. They cost, at a minimum these days, it would cost about $8 billion, and cost overruns are dramatic. And one new one has come online in the South, but another one never came online because of the cost overruns. Another really big issue with nuclear is what do we do with the waste? Those rods get changed out periodically, and we have no place to store them. There is no national place or no regional places where the rods can be stored. So the spent nuclear waste is pretty much stored on site at every nuclear power plant. It's first cooled in water and then put into dry casks right on site. The regulations require that the casks be able to take the force of, I think, a 747 and survive it. But we're creating more and more waste and running out of places where we can bury it. It's a serious issue. It doesn't become uncontaminated for maybe 1,000 years. It's a very, very long period when this is just harmful waste that's out there. Cary? This is a picture of a nuclear plant. Part of what you'll see is you pretty much have to see water around most boiling water reactor plants because the water has to be let out someplace to cool. And so there are usually these enormous lakes if they are not along a stream or river of some kind. The smoke that you see going into the air there is, it's just steam, it's just water steam. There's nothing harmful or radioactive in it. One of the reasons why nuclear, or the primary reason why nuclear has gotten so much attention again recently, is because, putting aside the waste, which is not insignificant at all, nuclear power plants generally don't contribute carbon emissions, so they are not a significant factor in contributing to climate change once they're up and running. Cary?
And then I think this is
Okay, so we're now going to talk very briefly about renewable energy, which, if Cary, can you go back to that chart? I think was slide 10 for just a second. Right. So this is, we're going now talking about the green from this slide, what that is made up of. Okay, thanks, Cary.
Mhm.
And what you'll see is that by far the largest share of that historically, until very recently, was hydro. And as Cary said, we put dams pretty much every large place that we could. And so hydro, the amount beginning at around 1970, stayed fairly constant. And going forward in more recent years, just stayed at a basically constant level. You do see some up and down in there. What's happening there? Well, what's happening there is, with the exception of years like 2008, when we were using less electricity in general because of the crash, water is a fluctuating source. It's not constant. And one of the particular concerns now is that a lot of the Western states are very dependent on hydro as a source of energy or fuel for energy. And as we see more and more drought, as is happening right now in the West, the availability of water becomes less and less. There's less snow in the mountains to run off into the spring and to fill the rivers and streams, and therefore to move the hydro in the dams. So that's a future problem that is one of concern, and another reason why we don't see hydro expanding. You do see, again, beginning back around, if you look really closely, the late 1970s, you start seeing biomass. And part of why you start seeing that is, again, the energy shocks of the 1970s, particularly in 73 and 79, when we started looking for alternative domestic fuel sources. And so we started burning things like coal and biomass, not coal, I mean corn and biomass, the waste of the trees and things like that. And that has increased pretty significantly as a share of our renewable energy use. It's kind of leveled off in recent years. And what you see happening in the most recent years is a huge expansion of wind as a percentage of our renewable energy. And in the most recent years, increases in solar. Part of what's happening there is, as the technology continues to improve and get more and more efficient, solar and wind have become price competitive with other forms of energy, especially natural gas and coal. And so they can, to some extent, supplant them. And we are also getting to a point where we are able to deal with some of the daily fluctuations in availability. The sun doesn't shine at night, right? So solar historically was not available as an electricity source at night. The wind mostly blows at night, and not as much in the day. So what do you do if you're trying to depend on one of these as a source of energy? Well, where we're headed is battery storage, different forms of battery storage, and a lot of effort being put into this now, which certainly makes these forms of energy more accessible and more efficient and certainly more cost-effective for use. Interesting questions about a lot of environmental issues surrounding the building of the batteries themselves that we're going to have to deal with, as well as some of the availability issues for some of the inputs into them. So one other thing I'd like to say about where we see some of the expansion in solar and wind is, and Cary will talk about this a little bit later, there are regulatory reasons for this as well. Regulatory incentives have helped to promote bringing solar and wind more online in recent years. Cary, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. I'll add to that as we go into the next slide here. And so, you know, in today's presentation, we're really talking about an intro to energy law. But the reason we just spent so much time going over the different energy sources is because, as I'm sure most of you know or can see very clearly from these examples, the energy sector is a massive, massive polluter, has, you know, really harmful consequences on the environment. But there are options to dramatically improve that. And so we can look at some of these things from the lens of an environmental law perspective, where we're doing things like putting the best emissions control technology on you know, fossil fuel power plants, or you know, regulating how much pollution can go into the water through the Clean Water Act, right? Or we could go right to the source of a lot of these issues and use energy law to transition to energy sources that don't have the same environmental consequences, you know, such as renewable energy, wind and solar. And so, you know, certainly there's a lot of nuance to the best approaches to making these transitions, and no energy sources without, you know, environmental and other trade-offs. But really, you know, the consequences of the current makeup of where our energy comes from, you know, especially coal, it's expensive, it's polluting, and we have better options. And that's probably the most effective way we can transition to, you know, cleaner air and, you know, avoid catastrophic climate change. So in any event, you know, that's why this is important from an environmental perspective. And that's why energy law is frequently the tool that is most powerful to actually address some of these problems. So those are energy sources. We're going to talk now about how do we actually get our energy, right? It has to be produced somewhere, but how does it get to, you know, the computers each of you are watching this presentation on right now? So, you know, early on in this process, you know, like early 1900s, energy was kind of a wild marketplace, right? You had, you know, tons and tons of private producers of energy and private sellers, or excuse me, private buyers of energy. And you just had these wires everywhere running from the buyers to sellers. And this is a mess. This is something we still see in a lot of parts of the world today. I don't know if, you know, you may have visited somewhere that it has an emerging energy sector and you've seen, you know, just wires everywhere. And this is from Manhattan, actually, this photograph here. And so this is kind of a natural part of the progression of energy regulation. Once we figure out, you know, the best ways to incentivize production, we've then got to figure out the efficient ways to make sure that it is transmitted and distributed properly. And so, you know, this is the starting point, right? Clearly, we have room to improve in terms of efficiency, in terms of safety. And so let's take a look at, you know, what some of those options are. So Nancy, if you're ready. Yeah.
So this is a basic schematic of how we traditionally delivered energy in the United States. This is still, in general, often how it's done. So this is a basic model of what we would call a natural monopoly, a natural vertically integrated generation and distribution of energy. So it begins actually a little bit before we get onto this chart with mining coal or producing natural gas or the wind or solar. So going back to what we were just talking about before about where the energy comes from, it's created in this power. It is transferred from primary energy to electricity in the power plant. That's where it's generated. It then has to get from there to our homes or to businesses or wherever we need to use it. And it's put on wires, and it is moves down the wire, and we step up the voltage for more efficient transmission. And transmission lines carry it over very long distances. And I'll point out again that we are constantly losing energy along the way as it is transmitted. And it goes a long distance. And when it gets close to where the source of use will be, into the neighborhood, it's brought down again to another transformer to a much lower voltage so that it can be introduced and carried into the house. As I said, this is the model for historically what we call a vertically integrated utility company. And historically, a single utility did and owned all of that. Can you go back for just a minute, Cary? Several things have started to change, and I just want to point them out on here. If you look at this, and we say it's a monopoly, and we want to start to introduce competition someplace, the most obvious place for that to happen is in generation. And that's where it has mostly happened, in generation. It has happened in other places, including the distribution and the transmission, but renewables, things like that, it's the generation where we have broken off most of the monopoly, totally vertically integrated utility. Okay. So what are some of the problems with these modern utilities? Well, one is they are, in fact, monopolies. And what does it mean if something is a monopoly? Well, there's a reason the game is called Monopoly, and why you want to own as much of any kind of property as you can. If you own it and you don't have competition, you can raise price. So it became apparent very early on that while utilities are these quote unquote natural monopolies, so that you don't have those wires crossing each other all over the place, and you can create this efficiency, you've also given a whole lot of pricing power to the utility. To deal with that problem, states developed what are called public utility commissions. The name varies slightly from one state to another, but historically, the power regulation was at the state level. Locally, it remains at the state level for what are called retail customers like us, or businesses that are buying the electricity directly from a utility, when it's been resold from someone else to them. And these public utility commissions became the regulators of the rates that could be charged, as well as where a utility could be built, whether one even could be built. You had to prove a necessity for it. And Cary, do you want to shift to the next one maybe? What was introduced was a basic rate-making formula, so that we want the utility to make enough money to make some reasonable profit so that it can cover all its expenses and still have an interest in staying in the business. And so the rate formula that was developed is the cost of service, just the operating expenses day to day of running a business. For example, paying things like salaries, and buying the fuels to generate with, The rate base is the capital investment, what it costs to build that plant. And then the cost, and that's multiplied times the cost of financing, which is the rate of return. It's what we need, what the utility must get in return for all those other investments and costs to make it attractive enough to continuing business. And that number that you get is called the revenue requirement. And that historically is what the utility is allowed to charge rates to get to that revenue requirement. So we pay a rate based on that formula, the revenue requirement that the utility is supposed to prove it needs in order to recover its costs and make a reasonable profit. Cary?
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. And so I think, as everybody can probably guess, as far as what we're going to talk about next, certainly if we're in a place, as was the case not that long ago, where the default way people got energy was by a vertically integrated monopoly that is regulated, it's great to make sure that customers are being protected in terms of the cost of their energy. Like, what is their energy bill going to be at the end of the month? That, of course, though, is not the only thing that needs to be considered in the energy sector. And so when you have these state commissions, these public utility commissions, whose primary responsibility is to make sure that the residents in their states are getting the lower energy rates, or at least affordable energy rates, there are going to be consequences to that, right? One of which is interstate discrimination. So there was this really famous and really important case in energy law in which we had a circumstance in which a state public utility commission had set up a system in which, from the court's perspective, they were making it more expensive for out-of-state generators to be capable of participating in in-state auctions. And this, of course, and I'm simplifying here so we don't have to go through the whole case together, but the basic story here is that this is discrimination against out-of-state residents, right? This is a clear violation of the United States Constitution. The problem, of course, is that at this point in history, we really didn't have a federal system for figuring out, okay, so if the states aren't going to regulate essentially the entirety of the energy sector or the electricity sector, who is? The federal government was not stepping in to actually take on that responsibility and deal with these really important interstate issues. And so the result of that is, Nancy?
Well, it's called the Attleboro Gap, just a gap in regulation. So what developed was the Federal Power Act, which has been amended, and we now have FERC, which regulates, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which regulates very heavily. So what I'm about to say now is very much the grand scheme. And as Cary said when we first started, it gets very, 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 very complicated. But the basics are that to fill that gap, the federal government, under the Federal Power Act and through FERC, regulates all interstate transmission and purchases of electricity. Local retail distribution is regulated by the states. So when we buy local power from our utility, it's the State Public Utility Commission that's setting that rate and setting the conditions for our buying it. When a power supplier buys it and is a wholesaler, or somebody is buying it from another state, it's federal law and FERC that controls the regulation. Cary? Is this me?
It's you, but I can take it and then I'll take it.
Okay. Why don't you go ahead, since you're transitioning into the next part, and I'll add anything I have to add.
Sure, sounds good. So, any system which is, as big of an economy as electricity production or generation and transmission, there are going to be efficiencies that can be gained by working within states, right? And so as soon as we have a system in which the federal government is stepping in and actually, playing a role in the regulation of interstate electricity transmission, we're also seeing a push for deregulation in certain areas. And the idea, of course, originally is that this is going to drive competition, especially amongst generators, and therefore it's going to drive down the cost of electricity for consumers, right? If it's cheaper to purchase energy that's coming from somewhere else, consumers should have the option to do that, right? That's the general thinking here. And Nancy, I'm just going to keep this one short unless you want to add anything to.
So the only thing I'll add is that deregulation, it's not entirely deregulation. It's a lot of change in regulation. And a lot of it is very much dependent on the state. Some states have deregulated significantly. Some have done it in a way that they've run into significant problems. Most deregulation has been on the generation side. I saw that Faith Bugle put in a note in the chat about distribution side, and unfortunately with the time limitations, we're not going to get into that today, but she's absolutely correct about that. But this is the extent of deregulation and competition remains very much state dependent. Decision making, very broadly generalizing, states in the Southeast have tended to remain regulated in the vertical monopoly sense, traditional utility sense. Cary?
Great. And so part of our federal system today is we have these wholesale electric power markets run by regional transmission organizations. And if this is a map of the United States that you've never seen before, I wouldn't blame you, because I had never seen it before taking energy law myself. But while not mandatory, joining one of these organizations is encouraged and does create an opportunity for interstate markets of electricity. Not everywhere, though, has taken advantage of this. Here in Illinois, our entire state is either in PJM or MISO, which covers different parts of the country and allows for purchases and transmission of electricity through those areas. But some places have opted to try to stay as isolated as possible. One of them is Texas. And the reason I want to talk about Texas today is because we've had some recent news out of Texas about a really unfortunate event over the winter, being this big power outage during the winter storms. And in response to that, a lot of criticism pointed and said, this is because renewable energy failed, right? This is why we can't have a climate conscious energy sector. But that is fundamentally incorrect. And I think it's important that we take a moment to talk about why it is that that was a failure of regulation, not a failure of renewable energy. So taking a look at this map, as you can see here, so ERCOT is the market that Texas controls entirely within its own borders, so as to avoid some of the regulations and burdens that it perceives to be a part of joining a national regional transmission organization. But importantly, not every piece of Texas is in this market, right? Up here in the Panhandle, I believe is the term, northern Texas, that's still part of SPP. And over here on the corner on the eastern side, that is also part of other regional transmission organizations. Now, looking at the map of Texas as to where these blackouts actually occurred, what you can see is that the places in Texas which were not in Texas's state exclusive transmission organization, in particular the northern part of the state, and to a lesser degree the eastern part of the state, these places weren't affected by the blackout in the same way. And the reason is because there was energy available in different parts of the country. It could have even come from Illinois, but Texas wasn't hooked up and wasn't regulated in such a way as to properly prepare for an event such as this winter storm. And the practical result of this is that Texas just didn't have enough power to meet the supply, even though this power was available in other parts of the country. So Nancy, any final thoughts on that piece there?
Yeah, the only thing I'd go do is if you could go back to the RTO map for a second. I just wanted to say one thing. So what these regional transmission organizations or RTOs do is, if you go back to the schematic in your head, don't go back to it, Cary, but just in your head, you saw those transmission lines. So historically, those have all been owned and managed by the vertically integrated utility. In an RTO, the utilities actually transfer sometimes ownership, but always management of those transmission lines over to the RTO. And so you have very centralized management of the lines and constant balancing of supply and demand in the electricity markets. It's just a moving so quickly constant. I wanted to make sure people didn't think that the other states that are in gray, that they do not have interstate transmission, because they do. They just haven't moved to the RTO type system. Texas, in contrast, where you see purple, it does not transmit in or out of Texas. So there was no way to get electricity in to meet that shortfall. And that's what is especially unique about Texas in trying to protect itself from any kind of outside regulation. It significantly cut itself off from other sources of energy.
Well, I think with that, I will say that we've really only scratched the surface here today in terms of the topic of energy law. But I hope that each of you took something away from this and enjoyed the presentation. I know we only have a couple of minutes left, but Jen, should we see if there's any questions in the chat or any questions from the audience?
Yeah, I think questions would be good. And I do want to take this time to remind people that if you would like to get CLE, I'm going to put the item in the chat, if you're an attorney, and please fill this out basically within the next 15 minutes so I can get your certification. I'll fill it out this afternoon. But anyway, thank you all for attending. Yeah, any quick questions anybody has? We're already at 12:58. If you have questions, per the CLE guidelines, we'll make sure I can get you. And you guys have my email. I'll also put it in the chat, but feel free to get in touch with me. On Energy Law 102. Maybe after the bill passes, we could do a CLE on the bill. But that would be really great. So please look for that. And if you have any questions, you can email them to me and I can send them all to our presenters. But I think this was really great information and we've got it recorded if there's anybody you want to share it with. So again, thanks so much for joining us today. And we have 3 more CLEs in this particular series. And I believe our next one is on June 14th. And on that one, we will be discussing the role of local government in protecting the environment. So we'll be talking with a number of people who work with township and municipal governments and the ways that you can advocate for those governments to engage in environmental protection. So again, thank you all so much. Don't forget to fill out the CLE if you're getting it. And we will make this available for distribution. I think this was a really tremendous presentation. So thank you so much, Cary and Nancy. This was some really great info. So thank you. And everybody have a great afternoon. Enjoy your Friday.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.